Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you are well. This is my second roundup for September. I'll put a link to the first roundup below where I talked about the first set of books that I read, first 5 or 6 books. And I've got another 5 books that I read in September to share with you now. And there are some real stonkers here. I think I actually enjoyed all of the books that I read. And they also all feel sort of in keeping with the spooky season. They're horrific and scary in various different ways. There is horror, there is gothic, and there is apocalyptic or dystopian as well. So all different kinds of horror in many ways. And hopefully there's something in these books that will appeal to you. So the first book I wanted to talk about was T. Kingfisher's What Moves the Dead. So I picked this one up a while ago. I started reading it last year but didn't get very far, and I just put it down. It's one of those books, I put it down, I don't know why, because when I reread it in September this year, I absolutely loved it. So this was written in 2022, and what spurred me to read it is that there is an adaptation of The Fall of the House of Usher coming onto Netflix, and I thought it'd be helpful to sort of know a bit about the story, even though it'll be completely different. I've even downloaded the original Edgar Allan Poe story, which I kind of felt like I would have benefited on reading before I read this, but actually it didn't spoil the enjoyment, it didn't spoil the story whatsoever. So I am going to go back and read that, because I've read so much Poe, but I've not read Fall of the House of Usher, so I'm looking forward to reading that one. But this one, yeah, it's beautiful. I think that T. Kingfisher really did Poe proud, particularly in terms of atmosphere and just description. The description is unctuous, and of course it's a, you know, clearly a gothic novel. It's inspired by Poe, but there's everything that you would expect here. There is a, you know, a crumbling house. There's an ailing family, and but it's also quite thrilling. It's a real page turner. It reminded me a little bit of what's it called, the Mexican horror book, which I can't remember what it's read off the top. I'll put it in the comments, because of its link to fungus and mushrooms. I wonder whether actually that was an inspiration for that particular novel as well. So basically, this is the story of Lieutenant Alex Easton, who goes to visit their childhood friends, Roderick and Maddie Usher. He receives a letter from Maddie that alarms him. She implies in the letter that her health is failing, and or her brother thinks that her health is failing, and she asks him to come and visit them. She's later on in the book, Alex tells us that they were not close friends, but they sort of played together, their lives intersected at various times, and he actually fought with Roderick during the war as well. There is mention in the book of particular nations and countries. They talk about Germany, they talk about England, but it's based in sort of an invented location, so it's not based in somewhere in the real world. So Lieutenant Easton comes along and he visits the family and finds that Maddie really is in a difficult place. And even from the beginning, I'll just read you the first sentence of the novel. The mushroom's gills were deep red colour of severed muscle, the almost violet shade that contrasts so dreadfully with a pale pink viscera. It's just beautiful, beautiful description throughout. But things are not well in the house of Usher. You know, the house is damp, it's almost alive itself, and it's falling apart around their ears. And there's also a doctor there, an American doctor, who is in the house, who's called Dr. Deaton, who Roderick Usher has called to ask to look at his sister, although he's more used to amputations on the warfield rather than, you know, working with women who seem to be, you know, fading away. So, but the two of them, alongside the help of a mycologist called Eugenia, who they meet, you know, he meets actually before he meets the family, they have to work out what's happening, what's infecting the family, what's causing this decay, and what's causing Maddie to fade away behind you know, the doors of the house. It's a real gothic thriller, but it also offers a lot more about it as well. We learn early on that Alex Easton was born a woman and in their society they've sort of have a really complex form of pronouns to describe the different genders, and soldiers have their own pronoun as well. So that was really interesting. So there's an exploration about gender, there's an exploration about sexism as well, and the restrictions on women in this age, which feels, you know, like it's 18th century, 18th, 19th century. It's difficult to pin down because obviously it's an invented world. But I really enjoyed this. It's only a short book. It's only 170 odd pages. Definitely recommend it. It feels perfect for the spooky season, and it's a page turner Gothic thriller, but it also asks a lot more questions than that as well. So really enjoyed it, and a good thumbs up from me. So next up we have one of the Booker shortlisted novels, which I'm so glad I picked up. I really enjoyed this, and that's Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. And if you follow the Booker and you're not sure which ones to read, and you don't mind something that's a bit dark and disturbing, I really recommend this. It's a dystopian novel, so tick on the box for the sorts of things I really enjoy. But it's so much more than that. It's absolutely stunning. So yeah, it's deeply upsetting. It kind of reminded me of Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. If anybody's read that, which was longlisted or shortlisted for the Women's Prize, which I also really recommend. It's a beautiful novel. But it's all sort of about how things in society can get bad really quickly. It's almost like that story of the frog in the boiling waters. You're bringing the temperature up, and they don't realise what's happening until it's too late. And so they're living in a fictionalised island, and it's slowly moving into sort of totalitarianism, fascism and war. And it touches on lots of really disturbing topics. It sort of raises awareness of the plights of refugees and people fleeing war-torn countries. It's just fantastic, but incredibly disturbing as well. So a crisis in the country has led to a government passing an act giving the Garda and judiciary emergency powers, and it forms an outfit called the Garda National Services Bureau. And our main character is Eilish Stack, and she's a microbiologist, or at least she is at the beginning of the book. And her husband, he is a trade unionist. His name's Larry. And right at the name at the beginning of the book, there's a knock on the door, and the GNB are there, and they sort of looking for him. And he goes to go and meet with them as he's asked to do, and we don't hear from him again. So that leaves Eilish at home with her 4 children of varying ages. We have Mark, who is sort of on the cusp of adulthood. He's an older teen. We have Molly, and then we have Bailey, who's sort of a quite precocious 14-year-old, and then we have a baby called Ben as well. And immediately Eilish's sister sort of reaches out to her and tries to arrange for them to get out of the country. But Eilish is in a really difficult situation. Her husband's missing. He could be returned to them at any point. And they've also been told that they won't be able to get passports for all of the children. So in some ways she's kind of trapped where they are. She can't leave with the family in the normal way. She also has a father who lives the other side of the city, who has dementia, and she's very concerned about him, and he's quite confused about the past and the present and what's happening. So things begin to deteriorate really rapidly, and what starts as a sort of a domestic setting soon becomes a war zone. But it's just really vivid. And it feels too possible, and there's this one thing that happens about 3/4 of the way, and that just kicked me right in the gut. It just, yeah, it really, I hadn't realised how invested I was in the characters until this actually happens. And it's just, yes, the whole book is sort of devastating, as this woman is trying to, this educated, clever woman is trying to keep her family together and trying to protect them. Her oldest son disappears also quite early on. He goes to fight with the rebels, and it's her trying to keep, you know, keep the rest of the family together, and also be somewhere that those missing components can come back to. But yeah, I really recommend this one. I don't want to give too much more away about it. It was really accessible, easy to read. You know, it sort of lures you in, I think, a little bit, but the language is incredibly powerful, and the story that's being told here is incredibly powerful, and it feels just too possible. So yeah, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, definitely recommend. If you've not read anything on the Booker shortlist yet, this is one that I would certainly suggest getting. Next we have a sort of a proper Gothic novel, which is The Lost Ones by Anita Frank, and this was published in 2020. And I really love Gothic novels, and when I first picked this up, I'd heard some good things about it, so I was quite looking forward to reading it. But it wasn't that I was disappointed. I found it quite slow to begin with, and it felt very familiar. It felt like a lot of those kinds of Gothic novels that I've read before, in a crumbling house at the turn of the century. The tropes, the locations, the characters all feel sort of really familiar to me. There was nothing that sort of felt unexpected, and you know, I like that, kind of like that about the Gothic novel as well, or some of the Gothic novels. They are, you know, interchangeable, and when I think back at them, a lot of them sort of get mixed up in my head. But what was quite interesting, by the second half of the novel, actually, I was really invested in it, and I was enjoying it. It becomes a real page turner. There's loads of family secrets and twists and turns and trauma from the past that are bleeding through into the present. So our main character is Stella Marcham, and she has recently lost her fiance Gerald in the First World War, and unfortunately she was enlisted as a nurse, and he died in her arms. So it's pretty, you know, she's reeling from grief of this loss. And when she was recovering from this loss, her sister Madeline, she was really there for her. She was really strong, and she was there for her and got her through it. But when her now pregnant sister Madeline contacts her, and she's living in the country pile, her husband's pile, Grayswick, but she has concerns and she's clearly sounding freaked out about something. Stella goes to be with her and support her, to pay her back for how she had supported her when she was going through the grief of losing Gerald. So she gets there, and it is that kind of you know, crumbling Gothic mansion. You know, a family who, you know, the house was probably once really splendid, but parts of it are crumbling, parts of it are, you know, you don't enter because they're not particularly safe. And where they had a big staff initially after the First World War, it was more difficult to get servants, and so they're living sort of under reduced means really in this country mansion, Grayswick. So the other cast that we come across are Lady Brightwell, who is the mother of Madeline's husband, and she's a very prickly character, not altogether likeable, very foreboding, and sort of sucks the joy out of the room. And her companion, Miss Scott, who sort of dotes on her and sort of is at her beck and call. And then in terms of staff, they have Annie, who Stella brings with her from her home, who it comes obvious early on that she has particular gifts. And you have Maisie, who is a nurse, sorry, not a nurse, a maid. And then you have Mrs. Henge, who's a housekeeper. So there's sort of like, there is still quite a wide cast. It's a bit of a whodunit from quite early on. And then on top of all this, we have a wounded war veteran and psychic investigator called Tristan Shears, who is a complete skeptic about all things. So he's called when Madeline and then Stella as well start hearing crying in the middle of the night coming from the abandoned nursery, and things sort of go downhill from there. But there were some really nice sort of explorations of gender, the difference in gender power, and sort of the time period, you know, how women were sort of talked down to, and you know, there's this sense that they're just two hysterical women who are causing distress. But as I say, you know, if you like that kind of Gothic novel. There's a lot to enjoy here. I think it could have been a bit shorter at the beginning, that nothing really much happens for quite some time, but when it does, it becomes quite gripping, it becomes quite intense, and by the end, I enjoyed it. And what I did think is I thought that it would make a really good film. I could imagine this being adapted into quite a good gripping Gothic novel, a Gothic movie. So yeah, you know, I enjoyed it, and I started off, you know, although I started off feeling it was a bit unmemorable, and you know, it was still very easy to read, very easy to access, although you know it was a slow burner. I ended up really enjoying it. So that's thumbs up. And then the next book I read, well, actually, I didn't read this one. I listened to this. I've been listening to it for a couple of months. And it's the Southern Book Club Guide to Slaying Vampires, which was published in 2020 by Grady Hendrix. Those who follow my channel will know that I'm a fan of Grady Hendrix. He writes very sort of black comedy horror, but books that have a lot more to say about them. They're just romps. They're really enjoyable. But there are other issues that, you know, that these make you think about. And this particular one I found, it was a slow burner to begin with, as the last book I read. And I think partly it was because I was listening to the audio version. The audio version was really, really good on Audible, and I did really enjoy it, but I can read quicker than I can listen. And so, you know, sometimes I feel like there's not much happening. But what's really good is you do get a really good insight into the characters and the world that the characters are living in. So it's set in 1990s, and it takes place over a number of years. And our principal character is Patricia Campbell. She's an upper middle class lady living in a really nice area with lots of other white middle upper class friends, and they by accident almost start their own book club, but instead of talking about the dry, boring books that they found in the past book clubs have covered, they focus on crime fiction and true crime. So they read a lot about you know, things like Marilyn Manson, Ted Bundy, all of those sorts of things, and they bond over that. And so we have Patricia, as I say, and she has her husband Carter, who's a doctor, and she has two teenage children, Corey and Carter Jr., who they call Blue. But the rest of the gang include Grace Kavanagh, who always answers for Grace Kavanagh here, a very sort of a very restrained upper class white woman in America. And then we have Kitty, Scruggs, Slick Paley and Mary Ellen, and together they sort of find a friendship and an outlet through this true crime book club that they'd never had before, a sort of sense of excitement. Patricia, you know, we learn early on, although she plays the part of the wife and mother, and she's sort of a perfect wife and mother, there's not much in her life that gives her excitement. She's kind of seeking that. She used to be a nurse, but she gave up that job to be with the family, and she's sort of missing that sort of calling and being needed in that kind of a way outside of the family. And then everything changes. One night, Patricia goes out to put the rubbish out, and she's attacked by the elderly neighbour, the aptly named Anne Savage, who is acting incredibly odd and going through the rubbish, and she attacks Patricia quite viciously. And then, you know, before long, you know, this character passes away, Anne Savage, so we don't really get to know sort of what happened and what led to this change in behaviour. She's always been seen as sort of formidable and unpleasant, but she'd never attacked anybody as far as they know. And her nephew, James Harris, comes to live in the house, and he's sort of a mystery to the society to begin with, but it becomes clear early on that he wants to be part of the community, and he works very hard to be accepted by the families in the area. But then we discover that people are going missing, particularly children are going missing, and a lot of them are going missing in the 6 Mile area, which isn't far from where they live, and it's sort of going under the radar. And Patricia starts having concerns and sort of suspicions about the handsome and unusual James Harris, who's you know, latterly come to join them in the community. So the second half of the book becomes a lot more of a romp. There's a lot more action. There were certain bits that I found quite hard to listen to, because it was just like, oh God, what's going to happen? And there are some quite grotesque descriptions in there as well. So it is it's a horror. It's a horror. It's easy to read. It's enjoyable. It's a page turner. But there's also a sort of a message there, or a realization that it's about the reality that monsters walk among us and we can't always tell who they are, and that there are people who mean to do us harm, particularly preying on the vulnerable. And there are lots of sensitive issues here as well, so you might want to gem up on them if you've don't know much about the book. And so there's a lot about child abuse, there's racism, there's some misogyny, it talks about suicide. There are lots of things going on here that are quite difficult to read, but communicated in quite a sort of almost light-hearted way, but in a way that has real impact. It just leaves you with a lot to think about. The thing that really struck me about this, I think, was the relationship between Patricia and her husband, and these really strong women and the way their husbands treat them. It just made me mad just reading about it. But I enjoyed it. I've read every book I've read by Grady Hendrix so far. I've really enjoyed it. I've still got my best friend's Exorcism to read, so I'm looking forward to reading that. But I've read a couple of others of his books which I've covered in previous videos. And if you love a romp, dark humour horror, then I do recommend you check his stuff out. So those are 4 of the books I read. The last one I'm not going to talk a lot about because I've done a whole video about it, which you'll have possibly seen, and I'll put a link in the comments as well. And that is my rereading of Wuthering Heights. So actually it was a lot quicker of a read than I thought it was. In my head I was thinking Castle Grades are going to take so long to read, but it wasn't. It was a real page turner, and I go into a lot more detail in the video, but in sort of summary, really, I really enjoyed it. It's much better than I remember it being. There's a lot to think about in the novel. It's not a romance, but it is bleak and horrific, full of characters who feel like they're unredeemable, but also full of twists. And you know, it definitely kept me reading. I wanted to read on, and not, as I say, how I remember it being, as being really difficult to read and not really very enjoyable. I did enjoy it, and if you've not read Wuthering Heights, then I would recommend you give it a go. Jane Eyre is probably still my favourite Bronte novel, in Tenant of Welfare Hall, but I really did enjoy Wuthering Heights and got more of an idea of why people enjoy it as much as they do. But as I say, if you want to know a bit more about my review, I'll include the link in this video. So that's my summary for September. I think I've read 10 books again this month, which feels like it's good going. I will do an update at some point of how many books I have actually read so far. I think I'm probably about 120 plus. So considering I set myself a challenge of reading 100 books this year, I feel like I'm doing really well. If you're new to the channel, do like and subscribe. Come along for the ride if you're interested in book reviews. I don't just read Gothic stuff. It just seems to be what I'm drawn to at this time of the year. So I do try and read a variety of things. And it'd be lovely to know what you're reading at the moment and what your recommendations are. So have a fantastic week, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.